We can get started. It's always a sign of a great event that people are a bit crowded, but there are, I think, still some seats. Is there a seat here? So please, if you're standing at the back and you would like a seat, then there's a seat down here and a seat in the middle here. So please don't be afraid of being cozy. Lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce RUSI's, I think, first conference with this title on Modern Deterrence, Securing Societies. And I'd just like to start with some housekeeping points. There is no fire alarm planned. So if one does sound, then please stay calm and await instructions from RUSI staff who will make themselves visible, including myself, straight away and guide you out the building. Secondly, this event will be held under RUSI rules, which means that all the presentations will be on the record, and those of you who wish to do so are welcome to tweet or otherwise report what is said, and I'd encourage you to use the hashtag Modern Deterrence if you do so. However, all the discussions, the Q&A, and will be entirely off the record, so if you do want to quote anything from that, you do have to ask the individuals making the point. And thirdly, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the conference partners who have supported this event, Clifford Chance, Uta Kumbu, the Estonian Ministry of Defence, and the Embassy of Denmark. And finally, but not least, I'd like to thank all my RUSI colleagues who put in so much effort to put this event together. It already feels, given the quality of the individuals we have here, that it's already a success by bringing you all together. And I'm very grateful indeed for the events team, for the people involved in the catering, for our media people, and not least to the colleagues from our military sciences group, and to Elizabeth Braw in particular for the intellectual work that made this particular event possible, and for all the organizational work too. So, why modern deterrence? If you go back to the history of deterrence since the formation of NATO, we first went through a phase of talking about massive retaliation, which I suspect nobody here actually remembers, at least as an adult, but nevertheless was for a while NATO's doctrine, which basically meant as soon as the Soviet Union crossed the Iron Curtain, the United States would unleash all its nuclear weapons, and that would be the end of the Soviet Union. And by the 60s, that was no longer credible, if it ever was. And we moved on to flexible response, which talked in suitably ambiguous terms about an appropriate mix of conventional and nuclear forces, and the need for a response that was credible and geared to the threat that was facing, but was in very large measure, almost entirely a military concept focused on the balance of conventional nuclear forces, with a war that in many respects felt like an evolution of, but not a dramatic departure from the sort of major wars Europe faced in the first half of the 20th century. Not least, it had sufficient ambiguity to hold NATO together until the end of the Cold War. But then, for a quarter of a century, at least in the UK, our forces spent most of their time in places and thinking about conflicts where the role of our military was not deterrence. It was stabilization and transformation. It was fighting wars rather than preventing them. And of course, deterrence in relation to major powers, major competitors, never went away, but it's fair to say it wasn't very central to the way in which we thought about national security or defense. And now, of course, it is. And there's a strong temptation in those circumstances to dig out the old playbook. It's a natural human tendency faced with complex situations to go for something familiar. And I think if this event today does anything, it should ensure that all of us individually get out of our comfort zone and think creatively about responding to problems which aren't easy to define, but certainly aren't a carbon copy of anything we saw before and won't be in the 5 and 10 years ahead of us. And the temptation to go back to the old playbook, of course, is particularly tempting because, of course, there are some elements of the current situation which are a replication of the old playbook. When we talk about nuclear doctrine and the nuclear balance of forces, of surprise attacks and tripwires, of 50,000 strong NATO exercises in Norway, or large Russian exercises on their territory in Belarus and so on, that's all quite familiar. And NATO is focusing a lot of attention on responding to those, as indeed we are at RUSI. We just published a major report on combat air capabilities, for example. And I think it's fair to say NATO is well suited because of its history as a military alliance to address those problems in coming years. But in other respects, the old playbook really does need revising and replacing, because our societies, both our own societies and those of our competitors, are very different than they were 30 years ago. They're much more globalized than 30 years ago. The flow of people, of information, of money is very different from what it was 30 years ago. And the technologies through which competition and conflict is engaged are also very different and continue to change very rapidly. And as a consequence, the intellectual starting point for this project is precisely to force us to think anew. Conflict in many respects is eternal, but the ways in which it is waged are always changing, and whenever one side gets strong in one area, competitors seek other ways to achieve their objectives, which is certainly true in relation to Europe today. In today's discussion, there will be a particular focus on societal resilience. And this term is used again deliberately to send a clear pointer that what we want you to do in our democratic and liberal societies, in which most of the key decisions are not made by governments, but made outside governments, to think about the role of non-government actors in contributing to security. Not only talking about those actors, but thinking about those in particular. Because in our societies, the private sector, civil society, individuals indeed have a key role in security, and it won't be, the old playbook really doesn't tell us very much about how to think about that. So hopefully that strength of our society in many other respects can also be a strength in relation to security, but it certainly can't be taken for granted. So in order to get us started in that discussion, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Baroness Martha Lane Fox to the platform. As myself, being a long-standing but humble special advisor to the Parliament's Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy, I can testify to the significant contribution she's made, bringing a different perspective to a room of national security parliamentarians who have other experience in relation to national security. But I think one of Martha's particular strengths, the reason why she's able to make a contribution, is precisely because, I hope you don't mind me saying so, you're not a securocrat, but you do bring deep experience in other elements of our national life, particularly the role of new technology sectors, the importance of developing digital skills, and so on. And you do believe, I think, passionately in the need for new thinking on national security. So, Martha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't think anybody is more surprised than me to be standing here before you this morning, except perhaps my father, who reminded me that when I was 12, I did a personality test at school to find out what kind of career you would be most suited to. My best friend, who's gone on to be an award-winning Booker shortlisted journalist and writer, was told to be a librarian, and I was told to be an army officer. So maybe things do come full circle. Or maybe there were other personality traits that was leading to that. In Malcolm's generous introduction, he showed my deep interest now in the world of security and defense, which stems from my long history in the world of technology. I've worked in the sector of the internet my whole working life, and I want to share with you a few perspectives from the last 25 years, because what we felt was going to happen in the late 90s, early 2000s, and where we find ourselves today are so wildly different that I think it still takes hackneyed old technology optimists like me to rethink the name of what we need to do in the future, of how we need to frame the arguments of the future. So lastminute.com, the business I co-founded with my friend Brent Hoberman in 1998, really didn't face any of the challenges that we're talking about today. The huge, enormous thing on the horizon that became an obsession for all of the tech companies at that era was the Y2k bug. This was the bug that was going to bring down the entire country. The Millennium Dome was going to explode. Who knows what was going to happen to our critical national infrastructure, because we were all going to fall prey to this bug that was going to ravage the computer networks. Well, it didn't quite turn out like that. And actually, far more profound and upsetting on a daily basis for our business, lastminute.com, was the incredible complexity of keeping credit cards safe on the internet, and not for the reason that you might imagine that we may understand now, but more because there wasn't really a way to keep them safe. Don't tell any of our early customers, but keeping them safe involved me inputting them into one computer that we kept separate to all the other computers, and when we wanted somebody's transaction to go through, I would fax somebody else with a fax machine with their credit card number on it. This was just 20 years ago. I mean, imagine if that was how a company operated today. So the issues of security and the important issues we face now feel so far removed from that early world, that early open, exciting world of technology that felt as though it was going to be democratizing, redistributive, new voices were going to emerge, and actually now naively it appears the more the people that were connected, the more conversations we were going to have, the more ability we were going to have to cross boundaries, to understand each other better, to share things in a new and exciting way. There was, however, a parallel report being written by the Pentagon in 2000 that I discovered recently that was sent to Donald Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary at the time, highlighting that, to their mind, the most important threat that the American economy faced was the potential for a crippling attack, a cybersecurity crippling attack. That's the exact words that they used, a crippling attack. And the recent release, I guess, of all the intelligence papers that reached their end of their secure time showed that Thomas Rumsfeld had read this report and taken it very seriously, far more seriously than the original author had perhaps thought that he would. And he'd sent off emails, apparently, as he always did, in the middle of the night saying, "What shall I do about this?" And I'm going to come back because 18 years later, it's interesting to reflect on what the Pentagon's advice was to Donald Rumsfeld and how we, I don't think, have yet still quite completed some of those initial thoughts about how to protect ourselves. So park that. That's the world of 2000. How many curveballs have been thrown since then? So many, it's hard to know where to start. We have an unbelievably complex technology landscape. I've argued recently that while we talk a lot about the liberal democratic use of the internet, about how incredibly successful Silicon Valley's companies have been, how we in the West are nearly all online, how the UK has the highest percentage of e-commerce in the world, we've got startups in London every half an hour being created in the technology sector. Actually, I would argue we hardly understand the internet at all. And the countries that do understand it are Russia, China, North Korea, and potentially Iran to a lesser degree. Now, I think we may have found ourselves looking in the wrong direction when we look back on the last decade. We might find ourselves worrying a lot about Silicon Valley's dominance of our daily lives, when actually we should have been looking in the other direction and thinking about the threats coming from different powers with far different ideas about what technology should be used for. You know, it's no secret that each of those countries has used the internet for nefarious purposes and for deeply troubling effects in all of our daily lives. Just yesterday I was reading again about a group I met in Berlin recently who are they're called the Syrian Archives. Some of you may know them. They're compiling a list and a database of all of the places in Syria that have been attacked by Russian troops, but that the Russian media has effectively rewritten in its telling of the war. Now, why do I mention this? I mention it because, to my mind, this is the kind of war that we are facing. This massive disinformation, not just that we read about every day around the hashtag fake news that Trump is deploying as a tactic, or the fake news that we know Russians are propagating around the world to undermine elections, but also a troubling and deep technical understanding of how to literally rewrite what has happened in wars that are happening right now. The Syrian Archive goes through and looks at photographs of areas that have been attacked by various different types of bombs and puts back the areas that they know have had attacks that the Russians have effectively photoshopped and then put in deep searches in Google. Now, I'm not a tech coder or technologist, but I know it's complicated to re-rank things in the search rankings of Google and to put things deep into the technology of YouTube. This requires commitment, expertise, and skill, and yet this is what is happening. So people searching now for bombs in Syria will find a very different set of images and reports to the reality of what has been happening on the ground. And without the bravery of groups like Syrian Archive, then we would have lost a huge amount of intelligence and understanding about what's been happening right now on our doorstep. This is extremely complex and upsetting. Similarly, we only have to look to what has been happening with Bolsonaro in Brazil. This is, again, a very nuanced and sophisticated piece of levels of technology that are being used by both him and his campaigners, but predominantly through the use of WhatsApp. Many of you may have read WhatsApp, as you may know, is end-to-end encrypted. It's hard to break. Bolsonaro and his groups have been infiltrating WhatsApp groups of friends, encouraging friends to share information. New York Times did some work recently to show that the sample size of WhatsApp messages that they managed to get hold of, 56% had complete lies, total untruths about candidates. And even worse than that there was a picture of Lula da Silva with the number of the candidate that you had to vote for, and actually when you voted for that number of candidate, number 17 I think it was a vote for Bolsonaro. They found only 8% of their WhatsApp message sample that had correct information about the election. Again, you might be sitting here thinking, well, what's this got to do with war? But this is about a constant undermining and a use of the complex technologies that we use every day in order to make us as citizens feel more unsafe and more ambiguous. It's something that I still find surprising, that this technology that felt as though it was going to empower us, that it was going to lead to greater access to better information, has actually done quite the reverse. So, now what? Are we at a dead end? Well, obviously I don't believe so. I think we haven't even begun to scratch the surface for the potential power of technology. And I believe we still have a huge opportunity in countries with different value systems to the ones that I've mentioned to be able to have resilience within our society. But I think it will rely on three big pillars. We have to bring together civil society, government and corporations in a way that I have not observed in public life before. I believe we need to have a huge upskilling in digital understanding across all three sections of the society that we live in. And I believe we need to put diversity at the absolute core of how we think about these solutions. So first of all, bringing together the different silos in our society. I was lucky enough to be part of the creation of the Government Digital Service. It was a new department created in the central government here in the UK. We reorganised how the UK government uses the front end of the web to deliver services to citizens. It may sound like a small project. It was actually an enormously important project because it reimagined the relationship between citizen and state. and it reimagined how you do policy. We found people in government who had written policies for years and years about various different issues that they had been asked to do, good civil servants, but they had never talked to a citizen about the impact of that policy on their lives. It's basic technology design to talk to your users, to bring them into the conversation, to test and see whether or not your assumptions are right. We managed to start to break down some of these silos, and we managed for a period of time to bring some very effective and impressive technologists into central government here in the UK to reimagine what public services might look like. We created gov.uk, we created many new services. But the journey has only just begun. And what I learned from that is that we need a much greater push within central governments to put digital understanding and digital technologies at the heart of how they imagine their services. Now, this may seem strange, but I'm also standing here saying there are vulnerabilities on the internet, and perhaps they are the things that have made us less secure. But I think government cannot shy away from this, and I think it's absolutely essential that citizens get the best services in the most robust and effective ways that they have been built. Otherwise, we are going to be open to attack. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves in situations like the NHS WannaCry ransomware attack. That happened because no one in the NHS had upgraded their software. They found 70 points of software depletion effectively. So what I discovered from doing that work in Government Digital Service was that we can change governments. You can put momentum around bringing people from different bits of the private sector in to create do public service work for a period of time. But that work never stops. And we have to keep momentum on it, and we have to keep trying to break down the silos between departments, because it can't just be one department worrying about security, one department worrying about cyber. This has to be across the board, and it has to be very, very rapidly deployed across government. So the second thing about building digital understanding, now the two are linked. It's very easy to look at the amount of people that have never used the internet. There's a lot of kind of work that now has been done around the world about the people who don't use the internet and why they don't and how we can help bring them into the revolution. And that is part of the challenge. But the other part is making sure that societies build constant digital resilience into how they manage their economies and their society. Digital understanding is something that continues to shift and change. It's not something that you can tick off in boxes. It's being able to make sure that you're on a constant learning journey about the technology around you, and that you are understanding and curious of the tools that are available to help solve the problems of the modern age. My small charity, Doteveryone, did some research recently to ask people about what they understood of the internet, and we found that people have 5 digital blind spots. And I think these 5 digital blind spots are a good place to start in terms of building resilience amongst society. It's about their data, about the transaction that they're performing on the internet, whether they understand what the nature of that value is. It's about how data is stored. It's about your privacy. And it's about how you as an individual are tracked as you go around, how advertising works around you. We can't ignore the world around us. We can't pretend that the things aren't changing at the pace that they're changing at. And building higher levels of digital understanding in all of our citizens, I think, is fundamental. I can't code. I'm a classical historian. I don't believe that coding is the answer to everything. We need more coders, but that's a separate challenge. I believe in coping. We need to help people cope with the extreme pace of change in the internet. And that, to my mind, is what digital understanding means. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by this new technology, they can feel empowered by it and as though it is working for them, not the other way around. I was surprised to see in the government's research from last year that actually the percentage of people and companies that had a formal cybersecurity policy had gone down between 2018 and 2017. It was 27% 2017, it had been 33% before. Now, I was thinking about this. It seems so strange when the headlines and all around us are quite the reverse. Maybe it's because people feel they're just unable to deal with it. Maybe it's linked to the fact that 70% of small businesses in this country don't buy or sell anything online. They have no basic digital skills. They're all linked to me. We have to put this at the heart of how we build a robust society in the future. So we need to break down silos in government if we're going to effectively deliver services that are robust and secure for the modern age and are going to help the most vulnerable people. We have to make sure that we involve the private sector in those conversations, as we tried to do in the Government Digital Service, but it is a journey that has only just begun. We absolutely have to make sure our citizens can cope, but we also need some to code. We do need far more people who are able to help with the dramatic shifts in policy, in product, and in the ways that we are going to have to build resilience into our society in the future. Right now, there are 600,000 empty jobs in the tech sector, and that is forecast to rise to 1 million by 2020. It's hard to break down that according to cybersecurity, but I pretty much have never talked to a company or an organisation that doesn't need cybersecurity help or some more talent focusing on this issue. How do we expect our ministers to make good decisions about defence and security when they themselves are struggling to understand these complex issues? I struggle to understand it, and I'm meant to work in the sector. So this is an enormously important challenge for any country, but I would like to see the UK really take the lead here, because it is not impossible to have a concerted plan to train hundreds of thousands of more people into both cyber and cybersecurity, but also more broadly in building digital resilience and skills. And fundamentally, I think this has to come from a more diverse range of voices and people. You know, I have no doubt that the challenges that we will face are going to come from somebody that look more like me than look like many of the people in this room today. I mean that with no disrespect, but I believe very profoundly that it's more likely to be a young Chinese software developer, probably a woman, that will attack our critical national infrastructure than a middle-aged white man who's worked in defence their whole lives. This is the nature of the threats and the challenges that we're facing. So unless we take bold and imaginative and creative steps to building a different kind of resilience and looking to solutions to different places, I don't think we're going to be able to meet those challenges. And the numbers are pretty dire in my sector. MLF statistics slightly made up, but it's not an order of magnitude wrong. About 96% of the world's software engineers are men. 96%. You know, that is not going to be able to help solve the problems of the modern age. It's essential that we put diversity and diversity of thought, not just gender, but socioeconomic background, ethnic background, at the heart of how we solve these problems. Now, to go back to Donald Rumsfeld in the 2000s, I was struggling with flight tickets and overbooked hotels, and the Pentagon suggested 3 areas that they thought that Donald Rumsfeld should immediately act on. The first was making sure that critical national infrastructure was separated from the internet networks, that they had separate servers and systems, and that the software would not be able to be under attack. And I can tell you, as a member of the JCNSS who's just done a report on this issue, that's a work in progress. We have front-end systems and complexity of legacy systems that are vulnerable. So I don't think we can put a tick by that Pentagon recommendation. The second recommendation was to make sure that there were always outside digital security experts, both in companies and working alongside ministers and government. Well, I think that also is a work in progress, as you can see from that slightly alarming number of the companies that have a formal cybersecurity policy falling slightly. And also the number of companies that say that cyber is one of their most pressing issues, but they don't know what to do about it. I think 67% of small businesses say that it's their most pressing issue, but they don't know where to go for help. So their second recommendation, bringing outside experts, it doesn't feel as though we've cracked that one either. And thirdly, and perhaps kind of most tellingly for someone with my background, they said that it must be essential that companies share information about data breaches and that government understand where the vulnerabilities are occurring, and that we use that to build networks of information and data sharing and understanding. Well, anybody that's been following Facebook alone will know that that is very far from being the truth. You know, every week it feels as though a company is revealing something that has happened, and not in real time, and not necessarily to the benefit of us as its users or as a customer. Just when I was searching just to see what had happened in the last couple of weeks, you know, we've had Visa hacks over the summer. We've had the BA Amex attack, one of which I was a victim to. We've had enormously complicated hacks across practically every single sector of the economy. So I think if I had written that report in 2000 that had ended up with Rumsfeld, I'd feel as though we hadn't done a very good job. We need to hurry up, and we need to do it right now. This is the slowest moment that we will live in the future. This moment we're sharing right now together is going to be the slowest moment of our future. These threats are going to speed up. So please, consider the world that I am painting a small picture of as a world we have to step into and understand, not shy away from or think is impossible. There's much to be done, and I encourage you to include more people that look like me in the conversation. So thank you very much for the invitation this morning.
Stay here for a moment. If you, Martha, thank you so much. I think that was inspiring, and I think it really certainly got my brain cells working, as is the function of an opening keynote speaker, to get us all really reflecting. And I particularly like the way you ended by saying we need to hurry up and do it right now, because I think you're absolutely hit the nail on the head when you say that it's not simply today's challenges we need to address, it's the multiplicity of challenges that are going to come and hit us in the future, and if we don't grasp where we are now, it's going to become more and more difficult over the period ahead. Now, we just have a short time if anybody would like to ask a question.